Hey there, welcome to the Lord to Death podcast. My name's Brett, and today I want to take a dive into a world that has become almost a cultural staple in gaming and television, and that is the world of The Witcher. In case you've been living under a rock for the last several years, The Witcher was originally a series of novels written by Polish author Andrzej Sapkowski, which has since been translated into many things, from board games to video games to a recent television show. And also just a very quick meta note, I realized that my last episode that I wrote before this one was just titled Withers, and this one was just titled Witchers in my notes. And so it's literally just one letter off, and I straight up almost just started re-recording my Withers episode because they're so close. I need to very clearly learn to differentiate things a little bit better, but that's besides the point. I have a lot of opinions on the Witcher series, and usually I would give my own little spiel on whatever I'm talking about, but I kind of just want to jump into it today. I will give the foreword, though, that I have only played The Witcher 3, and I have watched seasons 1 and 2 of the Netflix show, which I will kind of go into a little bit more detail as to what's going on with that, but I have not read the novels. I intend to, but basically, everything that I'm going off of is I had to research a ton for this one because I realized that I don't know nearly as much as I would have liked to before writing this episode. But I am absolutely in love with the world of The Witcher as it's presented in the games. I'm really excited to read the novels. And doing all of this research really opened my eyes to kind of what the world of The Witcher is like. So yeah, just the foreword that I'm kind of basic in the sense that I only really played Witcher 3, but without further ado, let's just kind of jump right in. So, the Witcher series started in 1986, where the author, Sapkowski, submitted a short story into a competition held by the Fantastica magazine, which is a Polish monthly fantasy and science fiction publication. Sapkowski's story was a retelling of an old Polish folktale where a princess turned into a monster as punishment for the incest of her parents. I'm not going to lie, that one skeezed me out a little bit, and I did not really look too much further into that. After about a year of waiting, he found out that he received third place, and due to popular demand, he began building the world that we all know today, with 14 more short stories before his first proper novel in 1994, called Blood of Elves. As of today, there are 5 books in the Witcher saga written up until 1999, with another standalone novel released in 2013. From there, these stories have been adapted into comic books by, and I apologize if I am entirely butchering this person's first name, Maciej Parowski, as well as Dark Horse Comics and CD Projekt Red. Also by CD Projekt Red is the video game series, which arguably brought these stories to life for an international audience. In 2007, they released The Witcher, with a sequel called The Witcher 2: Assassin of Kings in 2011, and in 2015, The Witcher 3: Wild Hunt was released to worldwide acclaim. The games collectively sold over 50 million copies as of 2020, with over 30 million of those copies coming from the third installment alone. Sapkowski wasn't involved in the games, however, so they do take plenty of liberty with the source material. But to that point, Sapkowski gave CD Projekt Red permission to take what he had created and do something new with it, using the characters that he had created in the novels. So at least he kind of greenlit them to do whatever they want. There have also been several film and TV adaptations, including a 2002 TV series and a film in 2001, both titled The Hexer. However, Sapkowski had nothing nice to say about either of these adaptations, saying, "I can only answer with a single word, an obscene, albeit short one," in response to these movies and TV shows. Then, of course, there was the Netflix adaptation, which first aired in 2019. The Netflix series, Sapkowski had a more neutral tone, saying that, "I have seen better, I have seen worse," which sounds about right. This series was met with mixed reception, although it was an instant hit. People loved Henry Cavill as Geralt of Rivia in the first season, but found the story a little difficult to digest. But despite the criticism, it did well enough to have been given another season, despite many of the cast members having publicly blatant issues with the writing and other things in development. And eventually it had deviated too far from the source material, to the point where Henry Cavill exited the series after the third season. And this is a crying shame because the first season showed plenty of promise, and was even beloved by those who had read the books. It wasn't perfect, but again, it initially showed promise. Then, with several deviations in the second season, and the third season ended up being boycotted by several fans, myself included if I'm being entirely honest, because of Cavill having daily arguments with the writers for disrespecting the source content, by trying to turn the Witcher series into a sensationalized Hollywood hit. I still haven't watched the third season, and I won't watch the fourth. I was happy with where they were going with the show initially, like many people, but I stand by my decision to not support where they are going with the show. And again, this is speaking as someone who never read the books, so maybe that says a lot about me. I don't know. And lastly, there were also two other Netflix adaptations. One, an animated film called The Witcher: Nightmare of the Wolf, and the other a live-action prequel series called The Witcher: Blood Origin, both of which weren't particularly received negatively or positively. I honestly couldn't find a consensus of whether or not people liked it or not, and whether or not that was because of the fan backlash of the live-action series, or because on their own they weren't anything special. It's kind of hard to say. The internet zeitgeist is kind of hard to read sometimes. But aside from the various board games, that's basically all there is for The Witcher. And I just want to take a quick side note to say that I think the etymology of The Witcher is quite interesting. In the original Polish, the series is titled as Wiedźmin, which is actually a made-up word. Wiedźmin is a take on the word wiedźma, which means witch. However, the word wiedźma is specifically a feminine word in Polish. If you know how Slavic languages work, then you know that pretty well every word has a masculine, feminine, and neuter variation. But there are some words that have no official male or female equivalent just because of the nature of the word. Witches tend to be women, and so there's only one word for witch in Polish, which is wiedźma. So Sapkowski changed up the ending of the word to have a more typically masculine ending, which ended up being wiedźmin. This is why earlier translations of The Witcher were initially different, like the Hexer or Spellmaker. But this is why they ultimately ended up with Witcher, because, well, it's kind of just a play on words of witch, so. There's one fellow, and again, oh my goodness, Polish last names just really give me a run for my money sometimes. This fellow was named Adrian Chmielarz, oh my goodness, who was a Polish game designer and claimed to have invented the translation from Wiedźmin to Witcher in 1996 or 1997 from a game that was ultimately scrapped and then later used by CD Projekt Red. Anyways, I didn't really mean to go on that long about the history of The Witcher, because today I don't want to talk about the Witcher series, but I want to talk about the history of Witchers. But I thought it would be apt to give a brief rundown of The Witcher throughout the ages. I just didn't realize that there was that much. I'm sure there are some people like me who have just played the games, and I'm sure there are some people who have just watched the show who might not have known about the novels, or at the very least, have never read them. But today I want to talk about what a Witcher is, why they are how they are, and go over their history, abilities, and uses. Now, in this episode, I'm not going to go over any particular Witchers aside from ones that actually shape the history of Witchers. So I'm not going to be going over Geralt's lore at all. I will be name dropping Geralt several times, but this is not an episode about Geralt. It's about all of the Witchers in general and how they're made. And I feel like I have to give the foreword that I'm going to be using both the games and novels to piece together some of this information. I know the games aren't strictly source material and shouldn't technically have a place here, but because of the popularity and how in-depth they went into Witchers, I think it's a great resource. And I won't be using the show as a reference, however, because it strays so far from the source material. And if I'm being entirely honest, it doesn't really give us that much to work with. So using the games and novels, let's dive into the world of Witchers. So what is a Witcher exactly? A Witcher, also known as a Wiccan, Wiedemann, or Witchman, is someone who is subjected to an intense alchemical process that involves the consumption of mutagenic compounds and relentless physical and mental conditioning. This training creates a versatile and dangerous opponent for monsters and other sub- or superhuman species. The poster boy for the Witchers is one Geralt of Rivia. He was active throughout the 13th century and is the main protagonist of the Witcher books, games, and the Netflix series. And we kind of already answered this question, but why were they created? Well, as humans started settling on the continent, and I have to take a quick sidebar to talk about the fact that the continent is unnamed and is only ever referred to as the continent, or by region when they're talking about the North and the South, which is incredibly frustrating to me. The North is often referred to as the Empire of Nilfgaard, but that's as close as we're ever going to get for a name for the continent. But that even barely covers half of it. Anyways, back to the question, why were Witchers created? As humans were settling the continent, they had to deal with hordes upon hordes of monsters that inhabited the lands that humans were ill-equipped to deal with. The solution was to create basically superhumans to deal with the problem. Fight fire with fire, or monsters with monsters. The northern rulers tasked their mages to create magic-wielding warriors that would deal with the scourge of monsters so they could freely settle the lands. The Witchers were allegedly first created at Risberg, a castle that was used by mages who were not under the control of the Brotherhood of Sorcerers, which included 18 masters and more than 80 adepts and apprentices who all lived there. They conducted many experiments which resulted in the creation of helpful things like elixirs, but was also home to many inhumane experiments like magical mutations and genetic engineering on humans and other creatures. Because of the nature of these experiments, the mages who resided there were seen as rebels and were typically frowned upon. However, the mages at Risberg were contacted because of their history with genetic engineering, not in spite of it. Allegedly, it was a master Cosimo Malaspina, a notorious master of genetic modification, along with his apprentice, Alzur, an equally famed mage, who created the first Witcher. In the spirit of inhumane experiments, Alzur would either have to pay parents to let their children go, or steal the children for their experiments, and the first Witcher was created in the 950s. So, plenty before Geralt's time. The first batch was 38 children, boys and girls, who were taken in to become the first Witchers. The mages had the children run dangerous obstacle courses, dodging swinging pendulums while blindfolded, along with other dangerous tasks. Because of the nature of these trials, 4 of the children died before they could even begin the alchemical process. The remaining children were put on a strict diet of bubbling mushroom stews and soapy alchemical teas to prepare them for the horrors ahead, which was known as the choice. At first, the children became faster and stronger, which was promising, but over time, most of the girls grew ill. The number of remaining children dwindled day after day as they were subjected to transformations until most of them died. Out of the 38, only 5 of the boys and none of the girls survived. But it wasn't over for them yet. The mages had professionals come from all over the continent to test and train the children, including hunters from Cadwyn, alchemists from Vicovaro, and swordsmen from, well, all over the shop. These folks would come in to train the boys in their respective professions. And it was at this point that they would be subjected to mutagens, changing their physiology while learning to fight with swords as well as a form of magic through rudimentary spells called signs. This process was known as the Trial of the Grasses. Unfortunately, for these poor children, this process proved unsatisfactory. While the mutagens opened up their bodies to a great flow of physical power, they ended up with limited magical potential, which was kind of the entire point of these experiments. And further, unfortunately for them, the project was deemed a failure when the first Witchers were presented to the nobles and the Northman rulers agreed to stop funding the endeavor. The failed experiments were banished, but Alzur was not done with them yet. Alzur was not an inherently evil man, and he wanted to see some good come out of the experiments so that he could help the world be free of monsters, as was his own personal vow. Some monarchs continued to fund the project in secret with Alzur at the helm, and the final set of trials and mutations was established along with the Order of Witchers. They fled to the abandoned Morgreg Castle in the Kestrel Mountains to continue their work creating functional Witchers. And once they had kind of got their stuff together, this was known as the First Age of Witchers. At Morgrave Castle, there were 5 Witchers to begin with, who were, at this point, unnamed except for the first child who was put through the transformations, named Erland. And we know that 3 mages, Cosimo, Alzur, and Idarin of Ulivo, who was responsible for creating monsters such as the Eater, which was basically a giant centipede with razor-sharp mandibles and pincers that he had created through genetic modifications, which Geralt hated with a passion. So it was Cosimo, Alzur, and Idarin who kind of ran the Witcher program at this point. On their way to Morgrave Castle, they met a traveling knight-errant named, and I'm gonna butcher this again, I'm so sorry, Taliesin Bledin Yorath Ape Llewellyn, which is an absolute mouthful, and so they called him Griffin instead because of the black griffin insignia that was on his shield. I'm guessing by his really long name that Griffin was probably from Skellige, but I couldn't find any information on who he was past his involvement with early Witchers. But the name definitely sounds like it could be from Skellige. I have no idea though. But Griffin would stay with them and help train the Witchers in combat, as well as teach them chivalry. Over the next several years, the Witchers would set out on what was known as the Path. This was the term for when Witchers would leave for the spring to different parts of the continent to take on monster hunting contracts. They would stay out through the summer and fall to return to the castle in the winter so they could catch up with their comrades and celebrate another year on the Path, and to mourn those who they lost along the way. And more Witchers would be made every year in an attempt to refine the process until eventually Cosimo, Alzur, and Idarin left Morgrave Castle, leaving only a few unnamed mages behind to perform the rites. I'm not really sure why they left, although I would have to assume it was because of the gruesome nature of the process of turning children into Witchers. Or maybe after a few years they just wanted to do something else with their time. All 3 of these mages were highly skilled in creating hybrid creatures, which is, again, why they were tasked with creating Witchers in the first place. So I would have to assume that maybe they got bored of the task of creating these mutant humans, and instead turned their interests elsewhere. That, or their investors' gold ran dry. The Witchers, despite their creators leaving, kept doing what they did best, setting out on the path year after year to kill monsters and make gold. However, with the number of Witchers increasing year after year, some of them started getting territorial. While the Witchers were taught chivalry and camaraderie by Griffin, it was only a matter of time before one of them turned sour. The Witchers began turning on each other, one by one. They would trick one another out of contracts and even kill each other if one didn't budge. There was one incident in particular that seemed like it was the catalyst for the fall of the Order of Witchers. One Witcher named Arnagad, a giant man who hailed from the depths of Gamera, who commanded great respect from his fellow Witchers because of his sheer size and physical abilities, attacked one of his brothers named Rhys. Rhys had negotiated a contract for the head of a chort that had terrorized a Cadwinian village. Arnagad arrived a little after the fact, unaware that Rhys had already taken the contract, which caused him to go into a fit of rage. Arnagad found Rhys in a forest where he was stalking the chort and cut him from shoulder to waist. A grim wound, but not fatal for a Witcher. Rhys managed to alert the chort, forcing Arnagad to fight it while Rhys escaped from the battle and fled back to Morgrave Castle. Arnagad anticipated that Rhys would have gone back to the keep to warn the other Witchers about his transgression, and so he gathered a group of his brothers that were loyal to him and had them follow him back to Morgrave Castle. This led to a confrontation between the Witchers loyal to the Order, who took Rhys's side, and those who followed Arnagad in his bloodshed. The resulting battle ended with the loss of several Witchers, but the Order prevailed against the tyrannous Arnagad, and those who remained loyal to him survived and fled to the Amyl Mountains. It was there in the mountains that Arnagad founded the Witcher School of the Bear, named after the pelts that he famously wore. However, eventually, Arnagad was later betrayed by one of his brothers, who, in turn, gave birth to the School of the Viper. I guess when you found a school based on brute force and killing your own brothers who stand against you, you're bound to lose your own head to the sword you once bore. He who founded the School of the Viper was named Ivar Evil Eye, and the school was located in the Tir Tochair Mountains. Sort of as this was happening, maybe a little bit before the School of the Viper was established, one of the Witchers named Ivan, who previously followed Ivar, left Ivar's group after he found out what Ivar's ambitions were. Ivan went off on his own to found the School of the Manticore, which found its headquarters in the Far East in the Korath Desert. So the order had splintered very heavily, and I'll go into what each of these schools mean in a bit, but I just wanted to finish this thought before I do. With the birth of these new schools, Bear, Viper, and Manticore, the order was, as I said, shaken. It seemed that collusion and betrayal was around every corner, and so a group of 20 or so witchers left Morgreg Castle to found the School of the Cat in Styga Castle. With them, they absconded with plenty of mutagenic compounds and alchemical supplies that were used to create witchers, in hopes that they could find a more efficient, less deadly way of creating new witchers. The ones who stayed with the Order at Morgreg Castle stayed and continued the path for some time, but became disillusioned with their purpose over the years. Morgreg had become a refuge for witchers to hide from other schools who had wished to overtake the Order, rather than the warm home it used to be. Erland, the first witcher, decided to leave with 13 of his closest comrades to found his own school, the School of the Griffin, which was named after the knight who taught them the ways of the sword. However, unlike the other schools, Erland left without malice in his heart against the Order. And so with that, he explained to the remnants of the Order that they were leaving, what their intent was, and left to Caer Seren to pursue their new school. The last witchers who remained in the Order felt no need to keep up with the facade that the Order meant anything anymore. So they abandoned their home in Morgreg to start a new beginning, and founded the School of the Wolf in the Caer Morin Valley, where they made a base in an old elven defensive structure that had since been abandoned. This signified the end of the Order of Witchers and the first era of Witchers, and ushered in a new era that would be known as the Golden Era of Witchers, or the Second Era of Witchers. Despite the way it happened, this era was actually a bit less backstabby, as there was no one order attempting to control all witchers, except for maybe the School of the Viper, who were literally all assassins and they were just terrible. The schools each split up the continent into territories that each school would operate in respectively. This actually made the witchers' work more efficient and organized, since there was less contention over who had what contract, and most contention would be taken up with their own school. Eventually, past tensions eased between the schools, and members of different schools were able to cross paths without bloodshed, since each witcher was aware of their own territories. They didn't treat those from other schools as brothers anymore, but they were no longer hostile at the very least. They acted more as estranged cousins, rather than bitter enemies, which was at least a start. As far as I'm able to tell, the only schools that made off with any mutagens and alchemical supplies to create new witchers were the Cat and Wolf school. This means that they should have been the only ones able to create new witchers, but I've read that each school was, indeed, creating and training their own witchers. I don't really know which to believe, honestly. It makes sense that they were all creating their own witchers, but it's just confusing that it was only specifically stated that a couple schools made off with any of the supplies to actually make witchers. Over the next 100 or so years, the witchers had grown too abundant and too successful. Monsters became increasingly rare, which meant that the witchers had less work to do. That, along with propaganda from the churches of the north and the distrust of the rulers, people started to view witchers as monsters instead of people. They were largely shunned, and the schools came under attack from various forces until the schools fell, and the witchers were disbanded. They were still able to operate in the shadows, taking on contracts where they could get them, but this marked the end of the Golden Age. Because the schools were largely destroyed, this also meant that witchers weren't created past this point. Geralt was allegedly born in 1168, which means that he was born just after the Golden Age ended. His becoming a witcher, along with his brothers, meant that the witchers were created for probably the next decade or so before they stopped. But I can't find too much information on this period, so I'm just kind of putting pieces together and trying to make sense of it. There's a lot of, probably intentionally, vague areas here. There was also the period after the Second Conjunction where the witchers experienced a resurgence. This would have been where the games took place sometime between the years 12 and 1300. Basically, the same conjunction that brought monsters in the first place, the conjunction of the spheres, happened again, and with it came many different beings that were introduced to the continent, which included a ton of monsters. Witchers were still largely frowned upon by most people, but they were suddenly needed again. And people did not shy away from publicly posting Witcher contracts, as they knew they had no other reasonable way to deal with the monster attacks. During this time, a new school was formed, the School of the Crane, along with new rules for Witchers, which was largely followed on the eastern coast. And that's basically the overview of the Witcher's history, and it introduced all the important elements which I want to go over in more detail. We have the trials, which we barely scratch the surface of, and we have all of the Witcher abilities, including physical and magical. And then we also have the schools. So we might as well work top down, starting with the trials, then move on to their abilities, and finish with the schools. So the trials, like I mentioned before, these were extremely rigorous and often deadly. Out of the initial 38, only 5 survived. That ends up being about a 13% success rate, give or take a couple decimal places. And that is including the ones that died initially before they even got to the choice, because even though they died in their initial training, they still died in the process, so I'm still counting them. But that number is also skewed in the original test group because there were both boys and girls in the mix. Of the initial Witchers, only boys survived. And if we're to assume that half of the children taken were boys and the other half girls, then that brings our boys' survival rate up to roughly 26%. But we don't know the ratio of the initial test group. I would assume that there were probably more boys than girls in the group, since girls, I think, were a bit more important to families in the Middle Ages. Boys were basically used as manual labor machines, while girls would be around to help mom around the house and eventually sire more children into the workforce, or be sold off to another family in a wedding. So you'd think that the ones who were less likely to be fussed about when kidnapped or sold to a shady mage, I think that it would be the boys who would have been sold more easily, but that's just my opinion. There's nothing that I can find that actually backs that up other than the way that children are talked about from that period. And by that period, I mean kind of referencing the Middle Ages. But this is also a fantasy, so who knows what real-world logic actually applies to the story? I don't know. And that kind of brings me around to my next point, which is that all of the children who were turned into Witchers were, well, children. I, again, couldn't find a source for this, but I think that a strange comparison to Star Wars is actually a good metric to which we can explain why children were taken instead of adults. In Star Wars, children are taken because they are more malleable. In that case, it's because they can be easily mentally conditioned to be able to control the Force, but also because if you're physically active as a child, you're much more likely to be physically active and healthy as an adult. I think that the malleability of a child's mind and body are exactly why they made good candidates for being turned into Witchers. Especially before and during puberty, your body is going through constant changes. You're learning new things and you're growing literally every day. This helps when you need to physically condition someone to be a natural fighter, because so many movements of fighting need to become instinct rather than thought. And we all know that learning new things and having them stick are much harder as an adult. Think about riding a bike. If you learned as a kid, there's a pretty good chance that you could not ride a bike for 10 years and then hop on one and it's as easy as, well, riding a bike. And I'm sure the same goes for athletics when it comes to swordplay as well. And having a malleable brain means that they're much more likely to be able to control magic, even if it's something as simple as the signs. But I think I've talked long enough about that, so let's talk about the trials themselves. I think it's worth mentioning that Sapkowski was intentionally vague about the trials that were involved in creating a Witcher. I think this is because by the time of the books, the art of creating Witchers was lost, and so there was no one in the books who would have had any reason to talk about it extensively. For example, the first 2 books were from Geralt's perspective, and his only knowledge of the trials would be from what he remembers as a child being turned into a Witcher. So keep in mind that while we know the process, there's not a whole lot of details surrounding the trials. We mentioned before that the first step in becoming a Witcher is called the choice. This was the first of 3 trials that a young Witcher must be subjected to. The choice consisted of a relatively easy task in comparison to the next trials, which was basically just a change of diet. But this was, as the name suggests, a choice. The decision must be made voluntarily because the diet of mushrooms, mosses, and herbs is not as easy as one might think. Many did not survive this trial simply because it's a terrible diet. Many died of liver, kidney, and heart failure as a result of the choice, and others succumbed to madness or exhibited abnormally aggressive tendencies because of how utterly awful it is to be essentially eating nothing but grass and mushrooms. While it might seem a bit extreme that people would have such a terrible reaction to it, you're really getting nothing that your body needs out of this process. There isn't a concrete explanation as to why this is necessary, but I imagine it's something like if your body can take being malnourished, it can potentially thrive under other rigorous circumstances that come in the next trials. And speaking of next, the next step and the first proper trials that the child would go through was the trial of the grasses. The trial got its name from the grasses that would be injected directly into the veins of the subject. This concoction consisted of corn lily, nightshade, speargrass, wild rye, and wolfsbane. It would be served in one serving to the child before the process in the form of a tea, and then they would basically be strapped down to a table where the grasses, along with mutagenic compounds, were basically IV dripped directly into their bloodstream. The mutagens were created, typically, from the albumin, an egg white or similar protein, of a monster. In the Blood and Wine DLC for The Witcher 3, it states that the albumin of the Pale Widow, a giant centipede-like creature similar to the eider created by the mage Adarin, was used as a base to create some of these mutagenic compounds. So basically you're injecting monster DNA into a person, which is kind of what makes them stronger. The trial of the grasses typically lasted 1 week, but most who would die in the process died by the third day. The survivors would be in a terrible state mentally and physically, subject to bouts of madness, and would fall into a deep stupor. Their eyes would glaze over and they would reach out for any items within their reach aimlessly, like a baby, while their breath got increasingly ragged and hoarse. They would be injected with the compounds again, and the coughing would turn into vomiting. They would wane until the 7th day when they woke up from their frenzy with cat-like eyes, heightened senses, and lightning-fast reflexes. This trial also granted the new Witcher slower aging, which explains why Geralt supposedly lived to be over 300 years old. Once they had completed the trial of the grasses, they would be granted a medallion, although it seems like this might have only been after the schools were created. There's no mention of the original Witchers having medallions, but we know that each medallion was created to represent the school that they belonged to. The School of the Wolf had a wolf's head, and so on and so forth. The medallion was more than just a means to identify which school a Witcher belonged to, though. As the great Witcher Vesemir once said, the medallion reacts to the presence of sorcerous auras in their immediate surroundings, making them aware of nearby spellcasting, active illusions, or magical creatures. It also warns the wearer of sudden dangers, giving them a heads up so they have an extra moment to react to a potentially life-threatening event. It wasn't infallible, however, but it was a great tool that acted as an extra measure of security and was invaluable to a Witcher. If one could survive the next 2 trials, then they would be presented with 2 more to finalize the process. Next was the Trial of Dreams, which there is almost no information on. We know that the children are subjected to a series of psychedelic visions by druids or mages. The only reason I can really find as to why they did this was to enhance the Witcher's vision to be sharper and to be able to see in the dark. I would imagine that this process was to enhance their senses as a whole, but there's really only one mention of the changes to their eyes. During this process, the prospective Witcher was also made to be sterile, making them unable to sire children. Although, there seems to be a bit of contention surrounding this factoid, and as far as I know, there haven't ever been little Witcher babies running around. Geralt was a known adulterer, which to me confirms that, at the very least, he is sterile. The next trial was typically called the Trial of the Mountains. For those in the Wolf School, they knew it as the Trial of the Medallion. Either way, it was likely the same sort of trial. The entire point of this trial was to test whether or not the Witcher was capable of remembering their training prior to the Trial of the Grasses, including combat, movement, and magic. There's a bit of information from the show, but like I said, I'm not going to be taking that as canon, and we're instead going to go with the information that we got from The Witcher 3, where Geralt remembers his time doing the trial as a wolf. However, I imagine it would be similar to the way that the Order did it, just in a different place. As we know from the Wolf's Trial of the Medallion, these trials were done as a group. While being a Witcher is a job typically done in solitude, they believed that endorsing cooperation was a vital trait. After all, who doesn't need a little bit of help sometimes? This was also likely their first foray into personally dealing with monsters on their own, so you don't want to take one of the only kids to survive the Trial of the Grasses and have them die immediately. So, strength in numbers. The wolves of Kaer Morhen needed to swim across a pond just outside of the keep, get through the caverns inhabited by an old cyclops, which they called Old Speartip, without waking him up. Then climb the troll's head, deal with some rock trolls, and get to a circle of elements in the cave. A circle of elements is a place where magic is strong enough that they typically have monuments built on top of them, where mages can come and draw their power from, and witchers can momentarily boost their own spells or even learn a new sign. But learning a new sign was specifically something from the game. I think that was a gameplay mechanic. It was likely just a buff of sorts. But this is not to be confused with a place of power. Places of power are invisible spots of magical concentration, which are similar, but to a lesser extent. In the games, witchers can use places of power to give themselves a magical boost, much like the Circle of Elements, but over a shorter period of time. It could do something like increase their agility and speed for a couple hours, or increase the potency of their signs for a few hours. Whereas the Circle of Elements seemed to be a more permanent thing. It was definitely steeped in more magic. Regardless, the Witcher would activate their medallion at the Circle of Elements and gain some sort of magical ability, marking the end of the trial. The only other school who was recorded that did anything differently was the Bear School. It was said that instead of going into a beast's cave, they had to climb up the summit of Mount Gorgon and retrieve a special runestone as a token of their ascent. Mount Gorgon was the tallest mountain in the area and was dubbed as the Devil Mountain. It was covered in fog and snow, making the climb particularly perilous. It's said that there was a number of bodies strewn along the mountain ascent where the witchers failed and froze to death. And no, despite the name, there were no Gorgons on the mountain as far as we know. The word Gorgon actually comes from the Greek word gorgos, which means grim or dreadful. So it's basically the Dreadful Mountain, which I think is particularly fitting given what we know. After this trial, most are considered to be a full-fledged witcher. If there was any doubt that an individual was ready or worthy of being a witcher, there was one final trial dubbed the Trial of the Sword. You can probably guess what that entails. The witcher in question would be given a task of their master's choice. Either they would have to take up their sword and slay a monster of their master's choosing, or they would have to take up arms against one of their brothers and fight another witcher. However, this comes from Wiedźmin Gra Wyobraźni, meaning The Witcher, a Game of Imagination, which is a tabletop pen and paper role-playing game based on the book series. I couldn't find whether or not Sapkowski actually endorsed the game or not, so I'm not sure if it's really canon or not. I think it's a bit of an odd trial, seeing as each Witcher would have to go through the same trials and survive to get this far, and pitting Witcher against Witcher seems like a fool's errand, because there are so few of them to begin with. Like, why would you want to waste the life of a Witcher simply because you don't think they will be perfect or optimal? It doesn't make much sense to me. But I think it's worth noting, at the very least, and definitely worth noting that it's maybe not canon just because it was from a role-playing game that was made, but interesting nonetheless. And that's it for the main trials. Some schools had additional trials that didn't seem like they were necessary, but rather seemed like a bonus mark that was related to their school in some way. I think that this might actually replace the Trial of the Sword, and might actually be a little bit more apt. But the School of the Wolf would occasionally have their Witcher fledglings blindfolded and sent out into the woods, in what they called the Trial of the Forest Eyes. They had to survive by relying on senses other than sight. And to complete the trial, they were to return to their master before the next sunrise. If they were caught cheating, or failed, they were hung by their feet for one night. The Griffin School Witchers were met with a choice. They were either to recite the Liber Tenebrarum by Sylvester Bugiardo in full, or they had to go out and fetch an egg from a griffin's nest. Apparently only one Witcher ever recited the book, much to Master Keldar's disappointment. There was another one for the School of the Cat where the Witcher's agility was tested by having them gradually walk higher and higher on tightropes. This is the only one that was actually really life-threatening because at higher levels, a fall would equal death even for a Witcher. In the Gwent card game, we get a little quote from the cat mentor which says, "If you fall, it's over. Your 9 lives are up, kid." Which is kind of hilarious, but also pretty dark. And then there is the Viper School, who give their trainees a pet to care for during their training that they would have to slaughter before becoming a fully fledged Witcher. In line with the School of the Viper's values, it's basically be able to kill everything you love. And that's really it for the trials that we know of. I'm sure that other schools might have had their own little quirks, but since the schools were lost, I'm not sure that we'll ever know what they were. So that brings us to our next point, which is the abilities of a Witcher. And surprisingly, the wiki actually gives a really great overview of the advantages and disadvantages of being a Witcher, so let's go through that. So we know that a Witcher's primary reason for existing is to fight monsters that regular or even trained knights could not deal with themselves. They are augmented through the process of the trials to be superhuman, which means that they are physically superior to even stronger people, but their training is not against other people but large monsters. While a Witcher's abilities might differ from person to person, the things that are pretty much the same across the board are cat-like eyes that grant night vision. So Witchers can constrict their pupils to see in blinding light or open them to be able to see in near pitch black darkness. This can be further enhanced with the use of a cat potion, but is typically not required unless they're going into an area with absolutely zero light or magical darkness. A Witcher would have no problem seeing at nighttime, even on a cloudy night, for example. But they might need to take a cat potion to be able to see in an underground cavern with no light sources. Along with great eyesight, their other senses are heightened as well to the point where they can identify an animal or beast just based on the smell of their blood, and even smell other beings nearby when they are out of sight. These two senses made a Witcher extremely perceptive, which meant it was impossible to sneak up on one or get away from one if they were tracking you. Both of these things were necessary for hunting monsters. They also had an overly healthy immune system which granted them near immunity to poisons and disease. This is also what allowed them to consume potions, which we'll get back to in a moment. We also know that Witchers had exceptional strength and agility, granting them extreme power and sharp reflexes. This allowed them to fight with a greater power than a non-Witcher with very little effort, and they could perform feats that a normal person could not. While a group of men might be able to take on a large monster in an equally large group, a Witcher's training allowed them to take on the same creature single-handedly. And this was because they could take hits that would normally kill a man and were seen shrugging off hits that would have been fatal to a normal person, allowing them to trade blows with monsters. Witchers also had the ability to cast basic spells known as signs, which I've mentioned a couple times before now. While the amount of magic they possess is not even close to that of a mage or a sorcerer, it was far more than the average Joe. These signs were able to be cast with a single hand, which meant that a Witcher could easily wield a sword in one hand and leave the other open for casting spells. The 5 basic signs were as follows. Ard was a telekinetic wave of energy that can throw back, knock down, or stun an opponent depending on their size. Outside of combat, Ard could be used to destroy obstacles like a crumbling stone wall. Yrden was a magical trap that was placed on the ground and would wound and immobilize their opponent. They could use this to temporarily trap their opponent in place so that they could land a fatal or incapacitating blow. Igni was basically a wave of fire that would originate from their hand. That's pretty self-explanatory. Quen was a protective shield that would grant a Witcher some protection against an incoming attack. And finally, Axii, a charm that could be placed on an opponent, potentially making them an ally for a short period of time. It was basically a lower form of mind control. And I think even mind control is a little bit much. It was more of a suggestion in someone's mind. It wasn't even kind of like the Star Wars wave your hand, these aren't the droids you're looking for. But it was a similar idea. Along with their ability to cast signs, their magical ability gave them a sort of innate sixth sense, which allowed Witchers to feel things around them, whether that be assessing spatial awareness or anticipating someone's next move. And we've mentioned this already, but it's worth mentioning again that Witchers also live for much longer than the average person. Hand in hand with this, they can also recover from injuries fairly quickly, giving Witchers the ability to live a long, relatively healthy life. Along with their superhuman abilities, the Witchers also have a variety of tools that they use. They were most known for carrying around 2 longswords, one made of steel for more mundane enemies, and one made of silver for magical or supernatural beings. These silver swords were typically made from meteoric iron, which were then coated in silver and inscribed with magical runes. Silver is a very soft metal, and therefore you could not make a sword entirely of silver or it would never hold an edge and would warp and break constantly. But being coated in silver still made it a weaker blade, which is why they had to carry around a steel sword. If, for instance, you were fighting an enemy that had a sword or a hard carapace, you would opt for the steel sword for its durability and raw strength. But if you were fighting something like a wraith, which is partially incorporeal, then you would want your silver sword since the combination of silver and magical runes would allow you to slay it where your steel sword would do nothing. Witchers would also carry around various oils with which they would coat their blades depending on the enemy that they were fighting. Many of these oils were very specific as to what they were fighting against, so the Witcher would have to know ahead of time what they were hunting so that they could prepare accordingly. Thankfully, they have fantastic tracking abilities, and as mentioned before, this made it very easy for them to know what they were fighting, where, and when. Depending on which school they came from, the Witchers would also sometimes carry a small array of medium to long-range weaponry. This might include something like a one-handed crossbow, or variant types of bombs or other thrown explosives that could be used against specific enemies to either damage or disorient. However, ranged weaponry wasn't as commonly carried as Witchers were primarily trained in close combat. Then there are the potions, which I also briefly mentioned before. Witchers were trained by alchemists to brew concoctions that would help them in certain scenarios. These potions could do anything from sharpened eyesight in the dark to increasing speed, strength, or spellcasting abilities. However, it was only Witchers who were able to make use of these potions, and that they would be wasted on a regular human because of how toxic they were. Witchers, with their enhanced immune system and resistance to poisons and disease, could use these potions in a pinch if they needed an extra edge in battle. But they could not abuse the potions or drink too many at a time, because, while the Witchers had a solid resistance to toxins, they would still be fatal in larger doses. All of these things in conjunction with one another made the Witcher what they are. They were bred to be killing machines, and killing machines they were. This led to a distaste from the public, which was evident in the attacks on the Witcher schools. A common belief amongst regular folk was that Witchers were not capable of having emotions, which made them less than human. I think that there is some merit to the idea that they have a limited capacity for emotions, since they were taken in as children and only ever really knew the pain of trials and murdering monsters. They were taught to have compassion for their brothers, but the children were never really properly socialized. This doesn't mean that they were entirely incapable of feeling, but I do think they had a somewhat limited experience in having human interactions. But they still do feel. A Witcher can live, laugh, and love on occasion. And lastly, I just wanted to touch on these schools and their traditional values. The most known would be the School of the Wolf, who were the last to leave the Order and the ones who kept the Order's values the most. They were typically recognized as the most professional Witcher school, and were known for reliably hunting down monsters without collateral damage, and therefore were the most popular. The School of the Griffin, which was named after the knight-errant who taught the Witcher's swordplay, was the most knightly of the bunch. They tried to keep to traditional chivalrous ideals and etiquette, so much so that members of the Griffin School were even summoned to courts on occasion to give advice and help settle disputes because of their high-standing morality and neutrality on the politics of the continent. They were also a school that focused plenty on using magic, unlike other schools who had a main emphasis on swordplay. And this lended them the reputation for their fighting style, which was very magic-heavy and favorable against fighting multiple opponents at once. The School of the Cat was made of a group of young Witchers who believed that they could perfect the process of creating Witchers to be less deadly. And thus, they were the only ones who were known to have female Witchers in their midst. But again, that comes from the pen and paper tabletop, so I'm not sure whether or not you want to believe that, but that's entirely up to you. The Cats specifically refused to be neutral in politics, and instead had their paws directly in the political soup. They had assassins, swords for hire, and spies in their midst that they would specifically hire out to political figures to carry out espionage and assassinations. Apparently, this behavior might have been caused by the changes that they made to the Trial of Grasses, which ended up dulling the emotions of the Witchers to a more severe degree. And some described them as almost alien-like because of their inability to exhibit the slightest bit of emotion towards their fellow humans. Their fighting style relied on speed and agility, as expected of a cat, and so their gear was more designed to be specifically lightweight and flexible to provide the greatest range of motion possible. The School of the Viper was in a similar vein to those of the cat, but were focused more on assassination. Not only did they accept contracts on monsters, but humans and non-humans as well. These Witchers were cold and ruthless. They trained to use twin blades rather than the typical longswords that Witchers used, which they called fangs. The point was to overwhelm their opponents with flurries of blows. If you throw 100 blows in quick succession, you're bound to hit one or two of them. The Viper School also specialized in alchemy, using various poisons to coat their blades. Allegedly, the school was founded with the purpose of defeating the Wild Hunt, and the school was just a means to an end to get people under their belt to be able to do so. And despite their devious behavior, they actually remained neutral in continental conflicts. But they still allowed themselves to be hired by political figures, but they never took sides. The School of the Bear, unlike the other schools, tended to be lone wolves. They did not rely on camaraderie and did not tend to form bonds with their brothers, but rather focused on themselves. This is because of the nature of the school's founding, as mentioned before. The founder thought that any code or knightly virtues were just the result of an inflated ego, and favored autonomy without restraint above all else. Because of their home in the snowy mountains, the Witchers of the Bear School were hardened from the cold, ruthless environment, and were known to be incredibly strong and resilient. They favored strength and brute force in their tactics, wearing heavy armor and even possibly using shields at one point. They were also one of the only schools, along with the cat, who were regularly known to carry crossbows. The School of the Manticore splintered off from the School of the Viper after a disagreement in values, and ended up in the desert. They went from being contracted monster killers to being well known for being hired to defend caravans as they journeyed across the sands. This also included being the chosen defenders of these Arcanians on occasion. And the leader of the Manticore School, Ivan, was even their queen's personal witcher and bodyguard. The School of the Manticore also apparently tried to perfect the formula for creating witchers, and even tried it on these Arcanian warrior women to no avail. So again, canonically, there are still no female witchers. Unless you want to talk about Ciri, but that's a whole other thing. I'm not exactly sure how that plays out in the books. I just know the game, so I don't know. But having no access to the specifics of the rites and basically going off of memory, they weren't very successful in creating their own witchers. Their fighting style was more focused on defense with the aid of potions. The Manticore School witchers were often seen carrying shields made of meteoric steel and silver, the same make as the witchers' silver swords. Unlike the other schools, because they were out in the desert, they weren't affected by the uprising against the witchers that caused the other schools to shut down. Instead, they were doing another escort job for these Arcanians through the fiery mountains, where they came across a towering fire elemental that they were just not prepared to deal with. Despite having most of the school's witchers there, they did not have the firepower, no pun intended, to take down the elemental. And by the time the battle was finally over, most of the witchers had been killed, along with half of the royal family members that they were escorting. Because of this, they lost favor within the Arcanian court and were shunned. The Manticore School witchers that did survive were forced to scatter, and that was basically the end of them. And finally, there is the School of the Crane, and I think that this is the least amount of information that we have regarding any of the Witcher schools, which is unfortunate because the premise of their school seems so cool. We know that during the Second Conjunction, which we mentioned before, the seas beyond the eastern coast had become host to many sea monsters. This made travel to the island of Skellige and other islands nearly impossible. So, the School of the Crane was specifically made to fight off these monsters that plagued the seas and air. Because of their need to fight monsters in the air, they evolved from using crossbows to using early forms of guns, which I would assume would be some sort of flintlock, but I'm not really sure. The only other thing I could find about guns in the Witcher universe was a long rifle made by a sorcerer that propelled lead bolts using magic instead of gunpowder, which would cut down the amount of time needed to reload a flintlock-style pistol, since you basically just need to slap your ammunition in the barrel and away you go. You don't need to pack it with gunpowder or ignite it. But these guns were too bulky to be used practically anywhere, and so they were not popular, and this is definitely not what the Witchers used. But I would imagine that the guns that the Crane School Witchers used were probably magical in nature. They were probably just more compact. And the reason I say it has to be magical is because there is actually history where the mages in the Northern Realms tended to stifle any sort of technological advancements that would contend with their magic. And this did canonically include gunpowder advances. Gunpowder was a huge threat to mages since, they can cast a spell, but if I just, shoot them, it doesn't matter, I win. So they specifically stifled the production of guns and any sort of technology that related to guns. However, I'm just speculating what I think that the guns would be like, and all information that we have about guns in the Witcher universe are from The Witcher 3, so I guess when I say canon, you could consider it canon or not, depending on how much of a Sapkowski stan you are. But the Crane School Witchers wore little to no protective armor, so they could launch themselves around without hindrance. They basically just had belts for their various weaponry. When fighting, they would have a rope that was tied to themselves and to their mast, fastening themselves to their ships since they would need to constantly launch themselves off of it to fight sea and air monsters. But that's all we know about them. And I would cover the Order of Witchers, but I wouldn't consider that a Witcher school, and we've already gone over them, basically. They were the OG Witcher school, and there's not really a whole lot more to say about them. And with that comes the end of this episode and brings me to the question. What did you think? Do you think that if there wasn't the whole schism starting with Arnegad and Rhys, that maybe the Order of Witchers wouldn't have fallen? And more so, if the Order had stayed standing, do you think that the revolt against Witchers would have been as successful? Personally, I think that if all of the Witchers were in the same spot, they would have been able to stand their ground and potentially even fight off the armies coming at them. But at what cost? They would have been vilified and even more hated than they ended up being if they had won against the people. You can find us online at Lord to Death on your favorite social media websites, Spotify, Apple Podcasts, or wherever you get your podcasts. If you have any questions or suggestions for topics, please send me a message wherever you can find me or at lordtodeath@gmail.com. If you're using the Spotify app, there is a Q&A function attached to the episode where you can submit any questions or topics, and I would love to hear from you. And just remember, if a man approaches you and asks for your child so he can feed them mushrooms and inject them with grasses so they can become a superhuman, maybe don't give away your favorite son just because he dropped your favorite vase last week. And I'll lure you to death in the next one. See ya.